Hi everyone, it's Pastor Dave. I know I've been away a long time. I have no excuse. I'm lazy. Anyway, I'm here to break down the idea of global warming and why people take issue with the idea that the Earth's temperature is rising. Because I don't really understand it. The fact that 99% or 98% of the scientific community confirms the existence of global warming, meaning that the globe, all over the world, temperatures are rising. We are warming up. That should be not even open to debate. Because really, global warming, at least the idea of global warming, comes down to just a few questions or hypotheses that need to be confirmed using scientific method, using scientific experimentation, validation, that kind of thing. Because you really can't rely on your personal sense. You can't just go outside and say, oh, it feels colder today, so there doesn't seem to be any real global warming. So that's why you have to measure the temperature all around the world, and you have to do it over a long period of time so that you can see what happens. Is there a trend, an upward trend in the temperature? So that's really the argument, or that's really the hypothesis, or the question. Has the Earth's surface increased in temperature on average over the past, and since 1880? The answer is yes. Overall, the surface of the temperature has increased by about a degree centigrade, 0.8 centigrade, 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Doesn't have to be that particular, but it is on the increase. And more particularly, it has increased more intensely and more rapidly over the past 30, 40 years. So then it really has spiked up. And so just to answer the question, is there global warming? Meaning, is there an increase in the temperature of the Earth's surface? And the science, through thousands and thousands of bits of data and measuring temperature all around the world, indicates that the answer is yes. And not only that, if you divide the Earth into two pieces, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, most of us live in the northern hemisphere, the temperature is increased more dramatically in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. So it's easy to answer that first question. Has the Earth's surface increased in temperature over the past 140 years. That's right, 1880 to the present day, about 140 years. So since we've been measuring it, yes, there has been a steady incline, some of it fairly low, but even increased more rapidly over the past 30, 40 years. So we can answer that question, and there should not be any dispute. So the people who have this need to deny that climate is changing, that the temperature is rising, are not being genuine. I mean, if they really could say, well, no, it's really speculative, it's not. We have the data, and we can confirm it all around the world. The temperature is rising all over the Earth's surface. So it's really not sincere for anyone to debate that the Earth is not warming up. Because that part of the argument, you shouldn't have any problem. So you can't be a climate change denier by saying that, no, the temperature of the Earth is not rising. Because that, unless you have evidence, which you don't, that would counter that argument, or that statement, or the confirmation of that hypothesis, then you really have nothing to say about that. Because there's no point in saying it. It is just fact. We've measured this over the past 140 years, and we have the trend is obvious that the temperature is rising. So on that point, climate change deniers really have to concede. They say, okay, yeah, sure, the temperature is warming. And then the question is, well, why is it warming? And so a climate change denier will say, well, that's just natural. But a scientist might ask the question, well, we think the reason why the temperature is rising around the world is because there's an increase in the carbon-based gases, such as CO2 and methane. And those gases are particularly unique in that they do absorb heat. So if there's too much carbon-based gases or carbon dioxide in the air, in the atmosphere, then the excess heat that we generate down here will not be released into the atmosphere. So if it's trapped, it's absorbed into the gases, then the temperature will rise. I mean, that's the theory. That's not the theory. That's the hypothesis. So scientists have determined, well, let's ask the question, is there an increase in carbon-based gases in the atmosphere? And you go through a scientific process where you take samples all around the world and you try to determine how much gas has been, so when we started doing this 40, 50 years ago and what we're doing now, and there is an upward trend. There's a considerable amount more of carbon-based, or we'll just stick with carbon dioxide, which is really the most powerful heat absorber. Methane tends to hold on to a lot of heat, but it will release it quicker. CO2 really holds it on for a much longer time, and it's just trapping the heat. So the more CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, then the more of the Earth's heat that is generated is going to be trapped in the atmosphere. If it's not allowed to escape, then our temperature is going to rise. So that's the science behind it. That just tells you, okay, that's why these carbon-based gases are so critical. If you have too much of them, they're going to trap. And so the question is, well, is there a lot more? And there is quite a bit more. And they do it by parts per million. Somehow 302 parts per million. We'll just say CO2. And then it jumps up to like 450. I mean, these are estimates that we're operating on. But that's the trend. And it's a rapid trend. And if you go back, over the courses of the centuries, we just never have had as much carbon dioxide as we do have in our atmosphere right now. So the question, part two, is, okay, we agree the temperature is rising. And one theory is that the reason why it's rising is because there's too much carbon-based gases in the atmosphere. And then we ask the question, is that true? And the answer is true, yes. We do have much more carbon-based gases than we really have ever had since we've measured this or been able to measure this. I know we can't go back into the dinosaur period, but we can make certain guesses about it. But it isn't as accurate as just tracking it right now. And right now, over the past 40 years, you can track an increase in carbon-based gases being emitted into the atmosphere. We just can. So there's the science. So we ask the question, is the Earth's temperature rising? Yes. And then the theory is, well, why is it rising? And one theory was, or the hypothesis was, well, has CO2 increased in the amount in the atmosphere? And the question is yes. The atmosphere has much more carbon dioxide than it had even 40 years ago. So we've measured these things. And it goes back even farther than that. In the 50s we did it. So the question is, okay, is there more carbon-based gases in the atmosphere? And the answer is yes. much more, considerably more, since we started measuring these things. And even more so in the recent decades. It's definitely been increasing at a much more dramatic rate. In fact, right now we're at the highest rate we've ever been. So, what does that mean? We go, all right, then once we establish that, yes, there is in fact more carbon-based gases in the atmosphere, and you, as a climate change denier, can't really deny that part of it. You can't say, well, that can't be true. Even if it is true, it would be reason, it's just natural. It's all part of the Earth's cycle. All right, so then you try to figure out why. All right, well, why is there more carbon-based gases in the atmosphere? So we speculate, someone hypothesizes, well, it's because we burn more fossil fuel. Fossil fuel is carbon-based, like charcoal and oil. These are rich in carbon. And when you release them, much of the waste that is released is carbon dioxide. So it's a reasonable question to ask, do fossil fuels release the carbon dioxide? Can we account for the increase in carbon-based gases in the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels? And the reason why fossil fuel, now everything releases, if you burn biomass, if you burn your leaves, if you burn your grass, you're going to release carbon dioxide. So any kind of organic material and fossil material that will burn will release carbon dioxide. So the question is, well, why is it so much worse to burn fossil fuels versus burning trees right now or wood? Well, the answer is in the photosynthesis of plants. So if you take a tree, which has been spending all of its energy taking carbon dioxide out of the air and then changing it into organic material, bark, leaves, fruit, everything that makes up a plant, and then you turn around and burn that plant. So there's a net zero. So it absorbs as much carbon dioxide as it turns into organic material. And then when you burn that organic material, it's going to release that carbon dioxide back out. So in burning like ethanol or biomass, you have a net zero. So you can say, all right, the plant has absorbed a certain amount of CO2 and then it has released the CO2. So there's what, net sum zero, just that there's no gain. There's no reduction, but there's no gain. So it's better to burn biomass, living material, earth, organic material that's on the surface of the earth, because those are active plants that were active in the absorption of CO2, which helps lower the temperature. But once we burn it, then we put it right back. But in the process of burning that, we can do whatever mechanical things we're doing. We can turn a turbine, we can crank a shaft, and we can generate some kind of electricity. So even though we're using biomass, we're not adding to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's still not good because we'd rather reduce it. And that's why renewable energies would be better, because they don't use carbon dioxide at all. They generate electricity through the sun, through the wind, other ways. And so that there is no waste product with renewable energies. So it actually ends up being better. That's ultimately what we have to do, because we really have to drop that CO2 amount in the atmosphere. At least that's the theory, and it's a good operating assumption. We know fossil fuels and biomass fuels release carbon dioxide. And the reason why fossil fuels are more dangerous is because they were under the ground, and they have long since absorbed the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that's how we were allowed to have a living surface, because organic material, plants, through photosynthesis, they absorb the carbon dioxide, and then the waste product is oxygen, which is favorable to us oxygen breathers. So that's why fossil fuels are better left underground, because they've already done their work. They have taken the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they have buried it. So it is no longer going to be part of the atmosphere, or potentially part of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, we discovered this idea that we can dig up all that dead stuff, all that old stuff, and then release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And that's not good. So that's why fossil fuels are not desirable. They do the desirable thing in that you burn them, you can then turn that burned energy into electrical energy, and we can move things and create things. And so I get it, hey, that's pretty innovative. But it would have been far better to, instead of unearthing all of this dead organic material that is, fossilized or compressed into whatever fuel that is buried underground, and it would have been better to just leave it underground. Instead, we could have just used the biomass on the surface. We would just scoop up tons of organic material that's on the surface, because it's already done its job of taking the carbon dioxide out. And as long as they're just continuing to do that and live that way, then they're just gonna, if you just allow plants to grow and do their photosynthesis, their respiration, where the oxygen is released and the carbon dioxide is absorbed, even if it dies, that dead material goes on the ground, and eventually it gets buried, and eventually it becomes fossil fuel. So it's just a matter of the age. Once you take it out of the surface and then the material just decays naturally into the ground, eventually becomes fossil fuel, it's good. Then that CO2 is no longer a concern of ours. We won't have to worry about it. We do need to have some CO2 in the atmosphere. Let's not kid ourselves. We have to have some CO2, because we want to have some of the heat trapped so that we can stay warm. But there is a point where there's too much, and we start rising, and that temperature rise is going to cause the polar ice caps to melt, and that's going to disrupt the whole sort of air conditioning streams in the ocean. That whole system is going to go on, where we take cooler water and temperature, we take the temperatures in the cool air and we bring it down to the earth. So our little air conditioning thing, what keeps us at a nice temperate zone, nice living range, is good. So we do need to have some carbon dioxide to keep us a little warm, but we can't be too warm, because then plants die and we lose water and ice caps melt and oceans rise. So there is a real problem. So the global or the climate change deniers really can't deny the existence that temperatures are rising, and they can't really reject the idea that the reasons why the temperatures are rising is because there's an increase in carbon-based gases. And we can, and the scientific evidence will show that because we are burning more fossil fuels, that's why there's more carbon dioxide and other carbon-based gases in the atmosphere. These are not really difficult ideas, but in the form of a hypothesis, and then we can support it with science, we really can confirm those three things. Yes, the temperature of this Earth is rising. Yes, CO2 is rising, and other carbon-based gases are rising, are accumulating in the atmosphere. Why are they accumulating? Because we're burning more fossil fuel. Because all that dead organic material, which was long since suppressed in the ground, was now being reintroduced into the atmosphere. That could, if you just kept it underground, it would have been no problem. So it is kind of interesting why we didn't choose to use the biomass of the surface, which would have been a net zero CO2 production, and instead we unearth all of this other dead material. And that's unfortunate. I don't know why we made that decision, but we didn't know better. So that's why we have an increase of CO2 and other carbon-based gases in the atmosphere. It's just the way it is. So that's the science. So you really can't deny the rise in temperature. You can't deny the increase in CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere. And you can't deny that fossil fuels produce the CO2 and methane gas waste, and that gets trapped in the atmosphere. So those things, so to be a climate change denier can't really exist. It really doesn't make sense. We know we've confirmed those three things because you can do data. Yes, this is happening. Yes, this is happening. Yes, this is happening. Temperature is rising. There's more CO2 in the air, and there's more fossil fuel burning, which creates the waste product of CO2. And those are the reasons why there's more CO2 in the air. So what's the answer? Climate change deniers will say, do nothing. And it doesn't make any sense. If we can keep the CO2 levels at healthy levels and not at overheating levels, that's the answer. So if we stop burning fossil fuels, we'll not be adding more carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. And so if there's a reduction or zero fossil fuels wasting or throwing CO2 gas in the atmosphere, then what will happen? Well, the CO2 levels will come down, and they'll come down naturally. The plants, the vegetation all over the world will absorb that CO2, and they will keep taking it out of the atmosphere, and they will produce organic material. Now, the wise thing would be not to burn the biomass that's actively taking the CO2 out. We can eat the fruit of that production, but don't burn it, because then you're just putting the CO2 back. So that's why if we have other ways of doing energy, we should. So that's why we need to try to reduce the emissions of fossil fuels and increase the renewable energy, ideally. If we have to, we could at least temporarily burn biomass that'll keep levels at about the same. There's, like I said, zero-sum gain. There's no, whatever a plant absorbs will then release if you burn it. But so of the three possibilities, fossil fuel, biomass, and renewable energy, obviously, wind and sun, they don't produce any gases, no CO2 gases, no carbon-based gases at all. All they do is just generate electricity from the energy of the sun or the turning of a turbine with wind. I mean, those are the simple examples. There are other energy things. I'm just saying that's why it's a waste of time to be a climate change denier. I understand that politically you're so concerned that governments are going to have to get involved, and yes, we should work together and we should try to reduce the production of fossil fuel waste so that we can lower. I mean, it's a very reasonable assumption. The reason why we have an increase in temperature is because we have an increase in carbon-based gases, and that came because of the burning of fossil fuels. So if we stop burning fossil fuels, we're just going to reduce the level of CO2s, and we reduce the amount of CO2, we're going to reduce the temperature of the Earth. That is so simple. There's really nothing political about it. So it is a waste of time that if you really cannot come to the proper conclusion that the science is confirming, there's no reason for even a scientist to reject it. And those that do, they're just saying, well, the science isn't in. Yeah, the science is in. We know the temperature is rising. We know carbon base gases are increasing in the atmosphere. And we know that fossil fuels release those gases into the atmosphere. So we have everything we need. The question is now, can we turn it around? Can we do it in reverse? We still want all the energy so we can have the lifestyle we lead. That's absolutely understandable. And the innovation has already begun, and we really can. It's pretty kind of amazing, don't you think? We have energy created directly from the sun. That's pretty neat. I mean, we're not as good as plants are, because it would be also nice if we could help plants and increase these or invent the photosynthesis machine, where not only do we take water and carbon dioxide and make food, but we also, by taking out the carbon dioxide, will actually reduce the energy or the rate of CO2 presence in the atmosphere. And that's important. So it is not that complicated. And climate change deniers are just operating from a principle of fear. They have nothing to contribute to the notion that we have to deal with climate change. There's a very specific thing we can do to turn the effects of climate change around. We know it exists. There's no denying that. Temperatures are increasing. There is no denying that there's more carbon-based gases in the atmosphere. There's just no denying it. The science, the data collection confirms those two things. And why is the carbon-based gases increased in the atmosphere? It should be obvious, because we're burning fossil fuels. And it's not an unreasonable assumption. And to say that it comes from other sources just doesn't exist. There is science trying to prove that very point, and it doesn't happen. You can't justify the amount of carbon-based gases in the atmosphere, the increase, by just saying, oh, all right, well, it's volcanoes or some kind of natural process that's causing this to happen. It's not. It goes beyond the natural processes. The only reasonable thing is to say that, yes, the burning of fossil fuels is why we have more carbon gases in the atmosphere. And that's why our temperature is rising. So it is such a simple, series of steps that we have gone through to get to this place. And there's really a very simple answer in reversing that process. If we stop burning fossil fuels, at minimum, we want to create energy. So at minimum, we burn biofuels, and we don't burn too much. I mean, there won't be any more added to it. But between biomass fuels, renewable energy, I don't know. I mean, I can't say nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is dangerous because it's, oh my God, all the radiation. But, if you can do it safely, genuinely safely, and it doesn't produce radiation, I can see why we would at least temporarily use nuclear energy to supplement our energy demand. But let's stop pretending that somehow burning fossil fuels is not the culprit, is not the reason why we're in this crisis. And for you to understate or ignore the science is not helpful. And it doesn't do anything. You have no real political basis to believe. This is not an argument that really is winnable. And your resistance is causing everything to slow down. We need to make these changes. We just do. It's not a debate. It's not a political debate. It's not a 50-50 proposition. It really is about 100-0 proposition, essentially. Because the hypotheses have been asked and scientifically validated, and so we know the Earth's temperature is rising. We know it's because of carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere, and we know fossil fuels release those gases into the atmosphere. So it is such an obvious thing that if we stop putting more fossil fuels in the atmosphere and we rely on plants to absorb the carbon dioxide, the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we can then bring back the Earth into that temperate zone that we all love so well and has allowed our Earth to function pretty well. So it is just not debatable to say that we should do nothing, that fossil fuels really aren't the cause. They are. We know they are. And I hope I put that in proper perspective. But deniers don't operate on rationality, and they don't operate on just simple step-by-step exposure of what the problem is and then what the obvious solution is to set things right. And the solution is obvious. We just do it in reverse. We know temperatures are rising, carbon-based gases are increasing. We know fossil fuel burning is causing that increase. If we stop burning, the fossil fuels will return to a more normal level of carbon-based gases in the atmosphere, which means we're also going to return the Earth to its better, safer, temperate zone where we don't flood cities, where we don't cause major problems in climate. It's really that simple. Temperature increase, CO2 gases and carbon-based gases increase. Why? Because of fossil fuel burning. If we stop the fossil fuel, we reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We reduce the temperature of the Earth. Simple. It really is that simple. So there is no political position that you can take that is tenable. It's not. You're just an irrational, irascible type person. You just will refuse to accept not just the data, but the obvious and reasonable means to solve it. So the solution is very simple. It is very simple. And why you don't want to be part of that solution is beyond me. Why you want to refuse that is beyond me. I mean, why do you care about oil companies? Oil companies were smart. They would have created renewable energies a long time ago. They knew about this. They understood this better than anybody. But they created the climate change denier politics, which is not a real thing. There is no political position because you have no viable position, no tenable position, no arguably based position that you can legitimately defend why you would deny climate change. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. And it's pathetic for you to hold on to it because it really is that simple. I said my piece. All right. Subscribe if that's a thing. I don't even know if it is. Anyway, here's hoping you promote or share the word. Bye.